Shalom, this is Yair Davidiy from the land of Israel. Today we're about to discuss the Danish, the Danes, the Danish people of Denmark. We identify the people of Denmark with a portion of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Originally there were 12 tribes of Israel that were together in one country, in the land of Israel. They separated, they divided, that is 10 of the northern tribes seceded and created their own kingdom, their own independent polity. This entity was conquered by the Assyrians. All of its inhabitants were taken to exile, were taken to different portions of the Assyrian Empire. There, they lost consciousness of their ancestry. They became the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Nevertheless, physically, they remained together, and they retained something of their tribal coherence, and they moved, they migrated, and we can trace them, we can locate them, we can trace them, we can find where they went to, and we find them amongst peoples of Western Europe, of the North and Western Europe. And this is what the Bible predicted in advance, where they would be, and this confirms biblical prophecy. And we not only can we locate where the lost 10 tribes were in general, we can also, on the whole, determine which particular tribes were concentrated in which particular areas. So one of the areas is Scandinavia, and in Scandinavia we have Denmark, and amongst the people of Denmark we perceive, we see a good portion of those descended from the tribe of Dan. And when we examine different characteristics that were said to pertain to Dan, we find that these characteristics also pertain to the Danish people, and this helps confirm our identification. It strengthens the other proofs that we have on this subject, and that's what we're going to talk about today. In the nation Israel, there were two portions of the tribe of Dan. Actually, there were several portions of the tribe of Dan, but it's customary, it's accepted to divide them into two different sections. There was the southern section, the southwest around the area of Jaffa, Tel Aviv. Today in that area, it's still called Gush Dan in our time. That is the section of Dan, the area of Dan, and that was in the southwest. And in addition to that, we had other portion of Dan in the Galilee, and we had other segments of Dan in the north, much further to the north of Syria, in the area known as Kilikia or Cilicia, in southeast Turkey and northern Syria of today. And there we find an entity known as Small, the people known as the Dananu. The country was known as Small, and the Dananu had to be identified as a section of Dan, or the tribe of Dan, as we have proven. And even the very name of the country, Small, means north, which also pertains to Israel. And even today we still have in Sweden an important province known as Small Land, that is the same name, Small. And Sweden, and historically good portions of the south of Sweden were historically ruled by Denmark, and the Danish did settle there. So that is significant in its own right. As we say, we found in ancient times two segments of Dan, a northern segment and a southern segment. And we identify the people of Dan in the north with those of Denmark. We also find many from Dan amongst the Irish. The Irish on the whole are identified with the tribe of Ashur. Tribe of Ashur gave its imprint on the Irish people, and the most Israelites amongst the Irish are to be traced to Ashur, but there are also other elements there. The elements there from Judah, elements from Ephraim, and also a sizable portion from Denmark. And many of the attributes and characteristics of Dan also are to be found amongst the Irish, alongside those of Ashur. And today, through descendants from both the Irish and the Dan and the Scandinavians, but especially from those of the Irish, a large segment of the population of the USA are derived from the tribe of Dan. So that's worth knowing, worth remembering. Between the northern and southern segments of the tribe of Dan in the land of Israel, there were differences. Fishel Ma'al, in the book on the tribes of Israel, analysing the characteristics of the different Israelite tribes, he notes this. He notes that the northern segment of Dan were much different from those of the south, and those in the south had not only the qualities of the north, but they also took something of the southern tribes. Tribes of Israel were divided in different sections according to their mothers. Jacob, the forefather, was also known as Israel. Jacob had two main wives and two subsidiary wives. The subsidiary wives were the handmaidens of his main wives. His main wife was known as Leah. She gave birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The second main wife was the sister of Leah. That was Rachel. She gave birth to Joseph and Benjamin. Then we had the handmaidens from Bilhah, the handmaiden of Rachel, we had Dan and Naphtali, and from Zilpah, the handmaiden of Leah, we had Gad and Ashur. And all of these different sections have their own qualities and own attributes, which we'll not go into now, but and suffice to say that those in the north were different from the south. So till we find the differences and similarities between the people in Ireland and the people in Scandinavia, between those of Denmark and those of Era or Southern Ireland. The northern section of Dan had for its symbol a snake, or serpent. Sometimes it could take the form of a dragon according to different sources. And in tradition, the Danes and the Norwegians, who gave rise to the Vikings, when their ships had the carved image of a dragon on its prow. Also, the Samson, the hero who came from the tribe of Dan, he had attributes similar to those of a snake, as the Talmud explains. And he even was said to be lame in one leg, and he even walked. He left his trail when he walked, along the pathway like a snake does in the dust. And these and other attributes of a snake were associated with Samson. And Samson too was from the tribe of Dan. In the land of Israel, Dan had been divided into a northern section, with several northern sections, and a southern section. And the northern section was a later development. First over in the south, and then elements, segments from Dan moved out and they migrated to different areas in the north. But this, in the time of the judges, but this had been prophesied from the very beginning. Moses had spoken of it. Moses said that Dan is a lion's whelp. He shall leap from Bashan. Dan is a lion's whelp, that is the offspring, the cub of a lion. And he shall leap from Bashan. Bashan was the area to the east of the Jordan River, where we find the tribes of, in the east of the Jordan River, we found the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half Manasseh. Half Manasseh more to the north in Bashan itself. And then Bashan was to the northeast of the Jordan River area, and it was extended further upward, because we find on the maps of Ptolemy, geography of Ptolemy, an ancient geographer from the 1st century CE, but using material from 300 BCE or before then. And he mentions the kingdom, the areas of Bathanai. Bathanai is another way of saying Bashan. And here's Bashan extending right up to the north, right up into northern Syria, and the area of the Dananu, where people from the Dan settled, the Dananu settled, and correct, the kingdom was small. And they were beside Yadi, also a segment from Judah was also in that area, so here too we find Judah and Dan together. So this area is in effect an extension of the Bashan. It is part of the Bashan. It is like a leaping forth of the Bashan, as like a lion springing forth from that area. There was as Moses had predicted from the very beginning. Dan is the cub of a lion, he shall leap from Bashan. The word Bashan, rendered as Basil. Basil in Mesopotamia, another way of saying Bashan was Basil. Basil later became, according to Pliny, the Roman geographer Pliny, Basil was another name for Scandinavia. So we find Scandinavia being named after Bashan, Basilia. And it's safe to say that Moses had predicted that in the end times Dan would be found in Scandinavia, and Denmark is in Scandinavia, and the blessings of Moses to the tribes and also those of Jacob to the tribes were mainly to be fulfilled in the end times. So this in effect is an fulfillment. Moses was saying that Dan, or part of Dan, would be in Scandinavia, and that is where we find that the people of Dan in Denmark. We also find when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they were encamped around the tabernacle. They were split up. The 12 tribes were divided into 4 groups of 3. The northern section was dominated by Dan. It was named after Dan. Dan was the head of it. Dan and Asher and Naphtali were the 3 northern kingdoms, the 3 northern tribes, and Dan was at the head of them. And throughout the history of Scandinavia, Denmark, more often than not, has played a leading part, a predominant part, beyond its proportional representation. Denmark has much less people than Sweden. Sweden has more than 10 million people, Denmark less than 6. So too, Norway has almost the same population as Denmark. Nevertheless, Denmark has always, or nearly always, been the predominant party in that area. So here too we find the Danes playing a leadership role. So the very name Denmark, or Denmark in Danish, Denmark means mark, that is the border of Dan. According to their own traditions, their forefather, the one who gave rise to them, was Dan, known as Dan the Great. They were named after Dan. Also we have, from the 1600s, we have a source saying that the Danes had a tradition that they descend from the tribe of Dan. As to the Jutes were also in that area. As to the Jutes, descend from Judah, and that there were brother nations to the Angles. Now, what happened is that the area known as Jutland, the Dan is in effect a peninsula extending northward from Germany. The peninsula is known as Jutland. Beside that, you have large and small islands all around about, all pertaining to Denmark. So the region, the peninsula area known as Jutland, was named after the Jutes, or in the northern dialects pronounced Jute. Jute is another way of pronouncing Judah. The Jute and Judah, that is Jews, are one and the same name. They were named Jews. And these people, the Jutes who were in Jutland, they left. Also Bede, the Chronicles of Bede, the Anglo-Saxon chronicler of the invasions of England by the Angles and Saxons, he mentions that the Jutes joined the Angles and Saxons in invading England, and they settled in the south of England, and that they evacuated en masse. They all left Jutland and they came to England. But nevertheless, there was a period when they were there, and then they were together with the Danes, and we find throughout the peregrinations of the Danes an association with Judah. Even in at the very first, when the Danes, or the Dans, were in the southwest of Israel, they were neighboured by Judah. The activities of Samson take place not only in the area of Dan, but also in that of Judah. And Judah is involved with them. So too, when they moved to the north, to the area of the Dananú, it was small. There was an entity associated with Judah, according to archaeology and inscriptions and also biblical passages. There was an entity, a small enclave, one could say, of Judeans in that region known as Yadi. So here too we find Danes and Jutes associated. When we train their migrations, we also find elements from Judah associated with Dan. So this is worth noting. When the Israelites came out of Egypt, they encamped in the wilderness. The camps were laid out around the tabernacle, The tabernacle had to be built according to strict specifications, using rare and valuable metals and precious wood, and garments and different cloths and various materials worked up and all put together in intricate designs. It entailed a great deal of work, a great deal of craftsmanship. We find that Brit-Am from the tribe of Judah was in charge of it, together with Aholiab from the tribe of Dan. So here too we find Dan and Judah together. We find Dan associated with this working, with this workmanship. In Exodus 31:4 it says that they had to devise cunning work, to work in gold and in silver and in brass. These were probably bronze, and in the cutting of stones to set them, and the carving of timber to work in all manner of workmanship. And behold, I have given with him Aholiab the son of Ahisamach of the tribe of Dan. Also again in Exodus 38:23 it says Aholiab, son of Ahisamach of the tribe of Dan, an engraver and a cunning workman. Later we find that Solomon built the temple, and he requested from Hiram, the king of Tyre, of the Phoenician city of Tyre, he requested from Hiram assistance in supplying them valuable materials and also workmen. And so Hiram sent to him one of his chief workmen. So Hiram sent to him someone called Huram, his master craftsman, the best workman he had. And this person was a son of a woman from Dan. And elsewhere he is associated with the tribe of Naphtali. So according to tradition, his father was from Naphtali and his mother was from Dan. At all events, there were Danes in that region, in this Phoenician region of Tyre, and they were known as craftsmen. And Hiram was one of them. It says in 2 Chronicles 2:13 that I was sent a skillful man, endowed with understanding, Hiram, my master craftsman, the son of a woman of the daughters of Dan, and his father was a man of Tyre, skilled to work in gold and silver, bronze and iron, stone and wood, purple and blue, fine linen and crimson, to make any engraving and to accomplish any plan which may be given to him. With your skillful men and with the skillful men of my lord David your father. Again in 1 Kings 7:13 it says, now King Solomon sent and brought Huram from Tyre. He was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a bronze worker. He was filled with wisdom and understanding, and skill in working all kinds of bronze work. So he came to King Solomon and did all this work. So we see here people from Dan and also from Naphtali being skilled in fine craftsmanship. And the Danes, until this day, they have a tradition for this, for being makers and designers that of note, of originality, and of fine work, and they generate a significant value for the Danish economy, also known as business owners and as bearers of tradition, for proud crafts and designers. Danes are brought up to question authority, makes them powerful innovators. The small country is constantly coming up with revolutionary approaches, this is what we are quoting, to design, revolutionary approaches to design, environmental science, pharmaceuticals, biomedicine, food, agriculture, many different types of technology, and design, ability to design and to put into practice is a feature, is one of the talents that the Danish people had, and they had it. The Danes had this talent from the very beginning. Dan was also associated with ships. It says, why did Dan remain in ships? Actually, sojourn in ships. Why did Dan live in ships? Lema go oniot in Hebrew. Judges 6:7, the prophetess Deborah spoke of the people of Dan, of the tribe of Dan, and she described them as living in ships, as being in ships. And Dan has always been a maritime nation. The Danish have always been a maritime nation. They're surrounded by sea, and they are known for having been explorers, pirates, Vikings, seagoing people, fishermen, and maritime. And also they've been very proficient and well known as merchants, as people who transport goods over the sea. I'm quoting a description of the Denmark and the sea, and it says maritime transport has been a vital source of income in Denmark. It is continually growing hand in hand with increasing international trade. Danes have been active in the shipping business from the Viking area. Today, almost 10% of global trade is transported by ships under Danish control. Approximately 115,000 people work in the Danish maritime sector and the industry supplying the shipping industry. The maritime activities of Danish maritime companies account for about 24% of the total Danish export. So Dan was always known as being associated with ships, and even today, so the Danes are in a similar situation. Samson, the judge of ancient Israel, was known for having superhuman strength. See the Judges in the Bible, Judges chapters 13 to 16, concerning Samson, the Superman, the prophet, the person who was inspired through his strength to use it for the saving of Israel, for helping Israel. And he came from the tribe of Dan. The Danes have always had a reputation for being strong. The Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, 1150 to 1220 CE, he said that the Danes were the strongest people in Europe. So too we have articles, we looked it up on the internet, and Danes have a reputation for being health fanatics, for being very keen on sports, very keen on exercise, and they have a reputation for being strong. I quote again, Danes bike during winter, run in the rain with no care in the world, swim in the sea when the water is well below 20 degrees. Is this a Viking attitude or what? Danes feel proud of having Vikings as their ancestors. Besides, they're quite resistant to living in tough weather conditions, read cold and rainy days for most of the year, and so on. So the Danes have a reputation, as one source says that it's a stereotype. It's not exactly correct, but it exists and is based on something. It's based on impressions of people who visit Denmark and are impressed by it. They bike, they run, they eat good food. The country is small, the air is very clean. Everywhere you go, besides a million bikes, you shall see people running, even if it's snowing or raining. They don't care. They don't find excuses not to be fit. Mothers run while pushing their baby carriers. They often organise events to encourage people to do sports, marathons, bike races, even roller skating day, and so on. This is an attribute the Danish have, and we saw this brought to its primary expression in the personality of Samson in the Bible. The commentator Abraham ibn Ezra, 1089 to 1164 in the Bible, he said that the Dan and Judah were the greatest warrior tribes amongst all the tribes of Israel in that time. And when they marched forward, when in the order of marching through the wilderness, Judah was in the front and Dan was in the rear. Dan was the protector of the rear guard, where you put the second most formidable element to protect yourself. And their task was to take the brunt of the battle and to protect the rest of Israel. Not only that, we find that the Danes are both innovative and conforming. These sound like contradictory characteristics. Innovation and conformism, conforming to norms, social norms, don't usually go together, but in the people of Denmark they do. It says in Genesis 49:16, the blessing of Jacob, that is Israel, to his sons, to the forefathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Concerning Dan, he said, Dan, according to the conventional translation, he said, Dan will provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. The Hebrew original can more literally be rendered as saying, Dan will engage in judgment with his fellow as befits one of the tribes of Israel. The sages in the Talmud and Pesachim, Dalet and Pesachim 4, it relates of an individual who was always challenging others to come to court to resolve differences, whenever a difference of opinion or something that was doubt came up, he wanted to go to a court, wanted to go to adjudication. And when they examined his ancestry, they discovered that his forefathers had been from the tribe of Dan. So this was a characteristic of Dan. And the Danes in Denmark, they are always demanding explanations and challenging decisions. Everything has to put up for judgment. Everything has to be considered and discussed. They not only from their peers, not only from people of their equal standing to themselves, but also from their parents when they're children, from their teachers when they go to school, from their superiors in the army when they do army service, and from their overseers, from their bosses and their places of work. Everything has to be explained to them, and they demand explanations. Why this, why that, why not this? And this is what they are trained to do, and has effects. It works. It produces a strong society, a progressive society, an innovative society. Together with this, they have a strong sense of conforming. You don't stand out. You don't go against the social norms. They want to know why you are different, and they don't like it if you are too different without a valid reason. So this too, an aspect of Dan. Dan in Hebrew means judgment, to judge. And they judge everything. So people are afraid to go beyond what is socially accepted, even though they welcome discussions about it and explanations for it. And you can look it up on the internet. There are numerous articles on this matter, and what they say is you don't stick out. One of the unspoken rules of Danish society says, do not imagine you're anything special. Do not imagine you can teach us anything. Do not think you are who knows what. You are the same as us, and if you're not, you have to give an explanation for what you are doing and what you are thinking. And despite this, Denmark, I'm quoting again, Denmark, despite being a universal welfare state and having a widely homogeneous population, they're very similar in terms of ethnicity and economic equality, is characterized by a high degree of individualism. Despite conforming, people manage to give expression to their individual characteristics, to what they are, as they are. Another point is that the Danes are very straightforward. They have this aspect of judgment. They are straightforward. They know things. They say things. They cut to the point. You don't talk without a reason for talking. You don't say things without having something to say. And you also express yourself openly, and you present things as they are, as you see them. And you come on time. This is judgment. You make an appointment, you get there on time. You make an agreement, you keep the agreement. And you trust people. People say something, you expect them to do what they say it. You say something, you're expected to do what you said. And all these has an effect, a positive effect on the whole, on Danish society. People live up to it. And it is an aspect or a positive application of the principle of judgment. Dan will judge his people. That is how Jacob blessed Dan, and that is what Dan does. Danes are schooled from an early age to ask questions, challenge ideas, and debate positions. Danes are considered some of the most law-abiding people. Residents of the country regularly pay fairly high taxes without requiring their reduction. They are very civilized and never try to absolve themselves of responsibility for what they have done. We are quoting again. Criminals are rarely hiding from the investigation, and offenders pay their fines. In Denmark you accept things. You accept judgment. The authorities fine you for doing something you shouldn't have done, or maybe for not doing something that you should have done. Doesn't matter. And you get fined for it, and people pay their fines. I don't know, I should come to Israel. Anyway, criminals are rarely hiding from the investigation. Offenders pay their fines. Despite a special love for alcoholic beverages, Danish people have a calm temper. They keep their cool. They judge things. They put everything up to judgment. They don't get angry. They do not arrange fights to brawls. They prefer to resolve conflicts peacefully without the use of physical strength. Danes may be called very curious. Another point concerns irony and sarcasm. Now it's been noted that amongst the Irish are known for being sarcastic, for Irish humour, Irish practical jokes. They have a reputation for that. And Brit-Am, in an article concerning the Irish, he wanted to relate them all to the tribe of Dan. So we agree with him on most points that he made, but we say that Dan is actually a minority amongst the Irish. The tribe of Asher is dominant. But nevertheless, he made good points. And the points he made concerning one of his proofs that the Irish are descended from Dan is the use of sarcasm, of irony, and Irish humour. And the Danes have a similar type of humour. They have a similar attribute. And they also use a lot of irony, a lot of sarcasm, and Brit-Am quoted the sayings and the deeds of Samson that show this quality of being ironic, sarcastic, and so too amongst the Danes you also have it, but it's the same trait, but it's applied in a different way. This could be considered an aspect of Dan with din judgment. Irony and sarcasm involve showing how good or bad intentions have the opposite effect of what was intended. Sarcasm, you said that is a very good job. You did very well, when you actually mean you didn't do as well as you should have. The Danes have this attribute, and they use it very frequently according to descriptions. And very often it is good-natured. It is their way of criticising a person without necessarily offending them. They use humour to give their message over, and it works. And this is what they are known of. They have a gift for it. And this is similar to what Samson had, the trait that Samson had. So this too, in its way, is a proof confirming the identification of the Danes with the tribe of Dan. To a few characteristics of the people of Denmark, and we showed how these characteristics were those of the tribe of Dan, and helps, together with a lot of other evidence, confirm our identification of the Danes of Denmark with the tribe of Dan. And this is worth considering. It is worth knowing. It is worth internalizing, because the lost in tribes are now to be found amongst Western nations, and each and every nation in the West corresponds to an Israelite tribe, or in some cases to one or two Israelite tribes, with one or other of them dominating. And this is additional evidence, in addition to the general proofs that the lost in tribes are in that area. We can find specific evidence relating to specific tribes in specific regions. And this proves that those areas in question are descendants of Israel, and from these areas the British Isles were populated, so too was Canada, the USA was populated, so too Australia, New Zealand, and so too those areas are also part of the legacy of Israel. They're also part of the 10 tribes, so the 10 tribes settled, and even those who came from other regions, they came from Germany, they came from Italy, they came from Poland, we can show that they were different from those who remained behind. They were, as if to say, driven by a homecoming instinct, by a drive to reunite with their fellow Israelite brothers. And they too, according to the Bible, in many cases are also descended from Israelites. So this is what the message, this is the truth. Like it or dislike it, it needs to be coped with, it needs to be faced up to, it needs to be realized and internalized. And we have to know that the Lord God Almighty watches over us. He watches over every single one of us. He watches over all of Israel. He watches over every person in the world. There's a special eyes, if to say, a special concern for descendants of Israel, because the descendants of Israel have a future task to play in the world. According to biblical prophecy, they are special people, they are special tasks, and more is required of them. We have to become, all of us become better people, and do what we can And these teachings of ours may help show the way to some degree. May the Lord God of Israel bless you. Thank you.